welcome you here. We have a terrific program lined up for today. We're always glad that you can come. The whole purpose of this center is to encourage civilized dialogue on important issues. And I've known John Hailman for several decades, and every conversation we've ever had has been civilized. And so I know we'll have a good civilized discussion this afternoon. We're here to hear John talk about his book, From Midnight to Guntown. But in the process, we're also going to talk about John himself, who, if I had to be marooned on an island for 3 days, John would be on my top 5 to be marooned with. And only one of 2 men on the list.
Where is this going?
Downhill in a hurry. So with that auspicious beginning, let's start, John. You couldn't have written this book if you hadn't made the decision to become a prosecuting attorney. How is it that a person of your great accomplishment would decide early in his life to become a U.S. prosecutor?
Well, is my mic working? Good. My father disagreed. He said, will you ever settle down and get a real job? I think I was 27, 28 when I found, or was I older anyway? I had tried a lot of things. And I think what influenced me most was, if those of you who've read the book, I was working for Senator John Stennis when he was shot in now it's echoing. He was shot in a street robbery. And he assigned me from his hospital bed to work with the FBI and the assistant U.S. attorneys to prosecute the man who shot him. And that really, I don't know, something clicked. It was 4 or 5 years later that I finally did become a prosecutor. Actually, I came down to Ole Miss. They had hired me on the law school faculty. I came down to pick out my textbooks. I was going to teach evidence and con law. And when I got here, the U.S. attorney called me at home, or called me at the motel about way before I was awake, and said, you don't want to be a law professor, you want to be a prosecutor. I've seen you. You don't want to do that. And he said, just tell me how much they're going to offer you, and I'll offer you more. So I did, and then I called Parham Williams, who was then the dean of the law school, and said, Parham, I really want to teach law. I love law. I want to teach it. He said, you can teach it at night. We'll get you a job. So I did both.
That's great. And so did anything surprise you about being a prosecutor that you didn't expect when you first took that job?
This is a terrible thing to say, but it was more fun than I thought. It's cruel to say it's like a sport, but it is.
Well, anybody who would read this book would know that you had fun doing this.
Right.
And I should point out that this is the best-selling book in Mississippi for 2013. So not just your friends here, but a lot of people have found this to be an interesting book. You clearly took on this job with some relish. It's a serious job, but how is it that you could have fun while you're being serious?
That's a good question. It really is. I sort of wondered about that myself. I remember my daughter Allison, who's now a doctor in Cleveland, Mississippi, she was not too happy with me when she was 15 years old. And she introduced me to one of her teenage friends and said, this is my father. He puts people in prison for a living. But I don't know, I guess, most people take a job as a prosecutor for 3 or 4 years and then move on to private practice and make 5 times more money. But I think I just like the people. I like the characters, all these strange characters. I never got tired of it. And I liked helping the victims, and I don't mind saying I like punishing the defendants. I like to put them away, but I never got too tied up in winning and losing. I was just, well, this is a case. I'm going to do my best. It's like a sport. If you're going to lose some, and just don't take it too seriously. But another thing was the camaraderie of the team. I see a couple of my old partners out there tonight. The guys that you worked with, and later on the women that you work with, were I don't know, there's a sense of camaraderie. I worked in a lot of different jobs before this, and I was an aide to Senator Stennis, I was in private practice for 2 years, which just, I liked the cases, but I hated the billable hours. It was just so much, a different kind of pressure. To me, the pressure of trying cases was really not pressure at all. It was fun. That's cynical, I know.
I've had a number of lawyer friends who told me that they love the law. There's only one problem with being a lawyer. And it's like, what is that? And he said, the clients.
Right.
So when you moved over to the U.S. Attorney's Office, you didn't have to worry about that quite as much.
I never played golf because I never needed to build business. Well, the business always came to us. No. We did have difficult clients sometimes. The FBI is not always easy.
Right.
I had some, I dedicated the book not only to Charles, but to, and to my wife and daughters, but to Wayne Tishner, who was the best FBI agent I ever worked with, just a master. If y'all saw the movie Mississippi Burning, in Mississippi Burning there was an FBI agent who was played by Gene Hackman, a real schmoozer, really a good. When he'd go to town, first thing he'd do is go to a beauty parlor and get to know all the women that worked there and joke with them and carry on. And in an hour, he'd know everything that was going on. They'd tell him everything. And the guy the real life FBI agent who did that was named John Proctor. He trained Wayne Tishner, and he taught him all that. Wayne was just a master at getting along with people. And I don't know, he could send people to the penitentiary and they'd almost thank him. They said, well, I deserved it, okay. That was, I think it was the camaraderie.
Talk for a minute about the relationship between a U.S. Attorney's Office and the FBI. We're interested in your personal experience, but overall as well. Is it sometimes a point of conflict? Is it hard? Just describe that for us.
It is, that's a good question. It's interesting because, well, for at least 25 or 26 years, I was the chief of the criminal division. I wanted that job for one reason. It's an administrative job. You supervise the others and you assign all the cases. I mean, I didn't want it because I wanted to do that. I wanted it because I didn't want anybody else over me. So I tried to spend no more than 10% of my time on that. But one thing I did was try to match up the personalities. If a case came in, I'd look at the agent, size him up, try to match him with a prosecutor that he'd get along with. Because once you have a conflict, it'll kill the case, and it destroys your sense of pleasure in the job, and it's not effective. So I always tried to put people in jobs where they would be comfortable, that they had talent. It's like a football team. You assign certain players, certain positions, and what they're good at. I may have wandered off from your question.
Not at all. You had say-so, obviously, in who was assigned from the U.S. Attorney's Office, but you had no say-so in who was assigned from the FBI, did you?
We wanted to. You had to be careful, because if you tried to suggest to the agent in charge who you wanted, he'd give you somebody else. It's just like the Army. And you had to be subtle about it, almost pretend you wanted this guy when you didn't want this guy. But that was not always like that. There were other agencies, the ATF, very good, Secret Service. I guess, if this is wandering off again, but if I had to describe the one favorite thing I did in the U.S. Attorney's Office was working with grand juries, because grand juries are secret. It's 23 people picked by computer from voter registration rolls. They serve for a whole year. We always had 2 grand juries at the same time. Each one met every other month, so it wouldn't be too much of hardship. We formed some really strong bonds with those people. They loved it. And if our judicial system has weaknesses, that's not one of them, because if everybody could serve on a federal grand jury and see what they do, they'd be a lot more enthusiastic. And that's one of my hot topics is jury service is a lot more important than voting. Jury service is interesting. It's work. I served on a jury once. It's hard, but that's something that you'll always remember. People still stop me. I've had jurors buy this book and say, do you remember the so-and-so case? And of course, there's so many of them, but that was a favorite thing.
You wandered into this grand jury issue, so I'll follow it up. First of all, talking about secrecy in this center that extols First Amendment privileges is something that won't necessarily get you brought back here, but I accept that since you're a good friend. But I've heard some people criticize the grand jury system as rife with prosecutorial abuse, because a prosecutor can pretty much get whatever he wants. out of a grand jury. You've said it just the opposite. Explain the difference between those two viewpoints.
Well, we had a U.S. attorney I won't name that I really loved. He's really a good man. But he made the mistake one time of saying, quoting somebody else, and he said, well, do you think the grand jury will indict in this case? He says, honey, to the reporter, says, honey, I could get him to indict a ham sandwich if I wanted to.
That's right.
And there's truth in that. The only thing is, one thing we did in our office, when a case came through the door, it was assigned to a prosecutor to interview the witnesses, the agents, to present it to the grand jury, to try it, and to argue the appeal. Now, where the problem comes in, if you have units where, say, you got a grand jury unit, they bring in a bunch of cases, you take it to the grand jury, it's not your case to try. You don't care if you get an indictment. If there's a problem, it's somebody else's problem. It's not your problem. So if you get you can get a grand jury to indict, yeah, but then if you have to face the music, how humiliating is it when you get to trial and you can't prove it? And it's obvious that you have a bad case. So it's a self-policing system if it's handled right. Also, a bogus prosecutor, and there are some, can get anybody indicted, but in the long run you lose. I'm afraid I'm a pragmatist. I'm not so much believing in principles as in what works. Mm-hmm. And the grand jury is a wonderful tool. One of my favorite things to do was, when I didn't know about a case, I present to the grand jury and say, what do you really think? I'm not trying to persuade you. What do you really think? I tell one story in there about the lawyer who was indicted by the grand jury, and 23 grand jurors. It takes 12 votes to get an indictment. This lawyer came and voluntarily testified before him and got indicted. What he didn't know was the vote was 12 to 11. So 11 of them didn't think he should even be indicted. And we got to trial. It faked him out, fooled him, and he didn't take the stand. He was convicted in 10 minutes. So he was a very persuasive witness, but the grand jury being secret is different. Generally, say in state court here, it's not unusual for a prosecutor to put on one deputy sheriff with 50 files. Each one of them has maybe 2 pieces of paper in it. And at the end of the day, he's got 50 indictments. But hardly knows what's in there. In federal court, very different. We may spend 2 days just on one case, thoroughly going into it. And in a case, especially white-collar cases where there's a real question about it, it's subtle, we'll put on all the witnesses. We'll try to call the defense witnesses and just see if this case, I always think when I'm getting an indictment, this guy maybe has 2 kids in college. What is this going to do to them? And what is it going to do to taxpayers' money if we spend 3 or 4 weeks trying it when it's really not, it's just an iffy case. So I always like to feel that we had a solid case. There's nothing in our office, I'm rambling, but I never believed in, when I got a case I didn't believe in, I would just kill it. I would not try to pass it on to somebody else. Say, well, let them have this problem. You can't do that. You have to have something to decide. Just decide. You have to make a decision, take the responsibility for it.
You mentioned that some grand jurors had bought your book and commented on it. I understand family members of some of the people you sent away have bought this book. What's been the reaction of those people?
Surprisingly positive. This one, I was having a signing at Square Books during that big fair they had, what you call that, double-decker festival. And I'm sitting there, and suddenly I feel his presence. And this guy who must have weighed 280, he's standing over me, looking down. I said, Mr. Hailman? I said, yes, sir. I said, you remember Harvey Hamilton, the sheriff, the old one-legged sheriff? I said, yeah, I do. He said, I married his daughter. He said, I got a question for you. Should I let her read this book? I said,
and how did you answer it?
I said, well, have you read it yet? And he said, no, sir. I said, well, if you don't mind, you read it first. But I'm not trying to avoid your question. If you want my opinion, don't let her read it. I remember Wayne Tishner called me one day and said, get the Memphis Commercial Appeal. Harvey Hamilton's obituary is in there. It's like 4 columns long, and they're all about crimes he committed. It's just the only obituary I ever saw that reads like an FBI rap sheet. But let's see, what was your question?
This is why we've always enjoyed talking to one another. John, you mentioned, we talked about the relationship with the FBI and other federal agencies, but through all these years, you probably developed some distinct relationships, good, bad, or indifferent, with federal judges. Talk about that a little bit.
All right, that was, I was telling Charles, I was just reading a book this morning. It's a 1905 book written by an English barrister about how to try jury cases. And it's just remarkable. It's everything in it. It's just exactly like we do it today. He was about cross-examinations and opening statements, and especially relationships with judges. Now, in our system, a federal judge is more or less a neutral referee, a lot more respected, popular, but neutral. But they, I always was blessed. You know, I taught in seminars all around the country, and a lot of times they have people who are just pure politicians who appointed federal judges as a reward for political things they've done. We've never had that. We've always had really good judges. Now, you have different personalities. Judge Biggers is extremely bright and funny. I've always enjoyed him a lot. Judge Glenn Davidson from Tupelo was the U.S. attorney before, so it was interesting to have him first as one of us and then as a judge. But I never really found any problem. I did have one, that book I was reading this morning, Judge Center, who was a fine judge, had been a state judge before he's a federal judge. But he felt a lot of pressure, and he'd get in a hurry. And, you know, when you cross-examine someone, you can't just say, well, did you do it? You have to slowly, in 6 or 7 questions, just slowly kind of tee them up, and then you zap them with the question. Well, what would happen to Judge Center after about the 3rd question? He'd see where you're going. The witness didn't know where I was going. He'd say that and say, move on, counsel. Why don't you just ask him so-and-so? And they'd just blow my whole cross-examination out of the water. That's what the guy this morning was saying about English judges. Mm-hmm. They get the robomania. This is different. I've got to tell you one thing, Charles. If y'all haven't read this latest book by Willie Nelson, who blurbed the book for me. Willie said in his book, Roll Me Up and Smoke Me When I Die. Willie said, they said, well, you seem to get along with all kinds of people. And he explained that. He says, I never argue with anyone I disagree with. And at first I said, well, that's nonsense. Then I got thinking, oh, he means if you basically agree with them, you can argue about small things. But if you're totally at odds with them, there's no point. You're not going to have a meaningful conversation. That's what I love about the Overby Center. It's sort of the sort of thing. There's no shouting, screaming, no extreme partisanship like we've seen in Congress. But I got to tell you one Willie story in that book. That's how I met Willie, was talking about bank robbers. And he loves bank robber stories. He puts them in all his books. His latest one was just a one-liner. He likes short ones. Says, did you hear the true case about the nervous bank robber? I said, no. So I said, he went in the bank and said, put your ass up or I'll blow your hands off.
Well, in reading this book, John, it seems that you're fascinated with bank robbers. Why?
Well, maybe it's the art of the bank robber itself. It's a set piece. It always has, the same characters. You have the robber, maybe a lookout man. You have the nervous tellers who are trying to push the button to call the police and hand him a die pack, which is, a trick that appears to be money, but it really has a little explosive and a red dye in it, which is set off when they go through the door when they exit. You have a getaway car, and you have a switch car. They'll rob the bank in one car and they drive a couple miles and ditch it and get in their real car. And then you have customers may form a posse and chase the robber. But it's just, I don't know. And I also like them because, as I say in the book, for those of y'all who haven't read it, they did an IQ test about 1960 on federal inmates and found that bank robbers had the lowest IQs of all criminals. They've retested them now, and drug dealers are lower, but it's...
And so would you say it's easier to convict a bank robbery suspect than almost any other person brought before you?
Well, it depends on the prejudice of the jury. Things may be changing a little now, but I always said you couldn't possibly lose a drug case. People are so inflamed against drugs that you put somebody up for drug dealing, the jury's going to convict him, rather than take a chance on letting him go. Now it's child molesters. That'd be really bad to be a child molester in America. I mean, they just put him up there and they'd convict him. But bank robbers, there is one defense, and that is identity. They may wear a mask, or I remember I had a lady one time painted her face with lipstick, and went out and searched her car, and they found a bunch of Halloween masks. And she said those were just too uncomfortable, so she just went with a lipstick. Well, there was another one. Oh yeah, I tried a guy in Aberdeen one time. Aberdeen was always there's a federal courthouse there, but it always had good criminals, interesting criminals. This guy robbed a bank and was had a towel over his face. Nobody could recognize him, but he had a unique speech pattern. He stuttered. So I knew he was not going to take the stand. No way he could take the stand. But sure enough, his lawyer didn't have any other defense, so he puts him on the stand. I said, now, as James Earl Kelly, I said, Mr. Kelly, you robbed that bank, didn't you? And he said, I never even robbed a piggy bank. That was it.
You got him.
I thought we were going to lose him, but once he started stuttering, I said, oh, what if the jury thinks I'm making fun of him for stuttering? But wasn't any problem. He said one other thing. What was it?
So you learned a lot about the ways bank robbers work. Do they really think they're going to get away with it?
So many of them will go out and have 3 or 4 beers to get their courage up and then try to rob a bank, no planning. But we did have this one guy, Patrick Michael Mitchell. They called him Patty Mitchell. He was from Canada, Toronto, Canada, but he had an Irish accent because of his parents. And he was the best bank robber of the 20th century. He robbed around 300 banks, and he only got caught twice. First time he escaped, and then he tried to rob a bank did rob a bank in South Haven, which has a really crack police department, and they caught him. But he was a fascinating interview. I felt like a tenderfoot. I was asking, now, Mr. Mitchell, and he said, oh, call me Patty. Okay, so now, you've served time in several penitentiaries, and you've escaped from several. Did you ever, hone your skills or learn more about robbing banks from other bank robbers you were incarcerated with? He said, no. Said, those poor rascals said, they're amateurs, rank amateurs. Said, they don't know how, they're not bank robbers. They're fools. They're poor fools. But he was the one. You probably saw the movie Point Break with Patrick Swayze. It was a mixture of 2 different bank robbery gangs. One of them was his. They wore the masks of the presidents. They also called him a stopwatch gang. He carried a big stopwatch around his neck, and they were supposed to be in and out of the bank. I believe it was 60 seconds. They cased it and very professional. One time he wore a mask of Richard Nixon, went in the bank, and said, I'm not a crook. It was just, I liked him. He enjoyed his job. He was a professional. He said, I can't do math. I can't spell. What do they want me to do? Work in a car wash? It's just, I don't know.
You have a great reputation here in Mississippi, and that reputation began to grow when you started prosecuting white-collar crime. Talk to us a little bit about the trend. There was a time when you didn't really ever have much white-collar crime that was prosecuted. It may have always existed, but it just wasn't prosecuted. Tell us a little bit about how that came to be and what the consequences were from your prosecutions.
Well, it's interesting. Bank robbers are usually poor. Most criminals are poor drug dealers. You don't see many rich people who become drug dealers. But with white-collar crime, it's different. And I think Mississippi may be a little different from a lot of places. You find people like Bernie Madoff, who should have been executed. He's a hardcore, selfish, cruel. He's just totally useless. A lot of the white-collar people I prosecuted were different. They wanted to buy their wife a new car. They wanted their daughter to be able to pledge Chi-O at Ole Miss. They were really honest people who got in a financial tight, or as Judge Katie used to say, they wanted more of the goods of this world than they had. And they just got greedy, kind of like poor bank teller, say, who her husband goes out and gets drunk, goes to Tunica and blows the house payment. Well, she takes $500 one time. Next month I'll pay it back. Well, next month it's worse, and she takes $1,000. Pretty soon, 6 months later, a bank auditor comes in and catches her. And those are sad. And white collar criminals generally, I understood them. They're more like us. But there comes a time when they get out of control, and Tom Dawson's out there, a big white collar prosecutor, I tell you. It's always hard to convict them the first time. But once they've been convicted once, they don't have that good reputation to hide behind. That was like Dickie Scruggs is kind of an old subject. It's been running in the ground by now. There are already a couple of other books about it, but he was basically a good man. He thought he was Robin Hood, and
You call him Robin Hood in the book, don't you?
yeah. I think he felt that way. He saw opposing lawyers doing corrupt things, fixing juries, bribing jurors. That's one way if you want to bribe a jury in Mississippi. How do you do it? Pay the preacher. You find out who's on your jury. Give some money to some of the preachers. They pass it on to the jurors. That's a horrible, shocking fact, but it's one of those things I learned the hard way. But I don't know, white collar crime is, I'd say in a bank robbery, there's no question, it's a crime. The question is who did it, identity. In a white collar crime, it's just the opposite. You know who did it, the accused white collar guy. The question is it a crime? They always have some subtle way of saying, well, I didn't realize, I didn't mean any harm, I didn't understand. They're more subtle, it's a totally different universe.
Let's stay on that subject and move over to public officials. You've prosecuted your share of public officials. Robert Kayat's book that's just out talks about his father being prosecuted and convicted of doing what he had always done to please his constituents. Is it harder to convict a public official?
Well, that's why I got a call just the other day from the Sun Herald in Gulfport saying they wanted a statement from me saying you prosecuted a lot of corruption cases. Isn't it an outrage that they don't prosecute corruption cases in state court? They always give it to the feds. I said, not at all. Look, if he got elected sheriff in this county or a justice court judge, he has a lot of friends and relatives. You're not going to convict him here. Somebody's going to hang up the jury. But if you go to federal court, where we draw our panel of jurors from 37 counties, he's not going to be able to get to him and influence him. So it's normal that corruption cases of public officials go to federal court. I think it's good. It's not no harm in that at all. Jim Hood, when he was a local DA, we handled some cases that he couldn't handle, including the Scruggs case. Let's see, there's a...
So we're talking about public officials. Is it harder to convict public officials than it is other people who are charged with crimes?
Yes, because they obviously they wouldn't have got elected if they didn't have some charm and some persuasiveness to them. And they probably have done many good things if the voters have elected them. And they're hard to catch. They're usually pretty smart, pretty slick. But at the same time, I learned an interesting thing in picking jurors. So we convicted 60 county supervisors back in the 1980s. And one thing I found was older people are more forgiving. They're used to the corruption. They've seen it growing up. They know supervisors gravel your driveway or give you a culvert. Younger people are more idealistic. I always learned to have young people on a jury. They'll convict a public official sooner. But those are interesting cases. I loved prosecuting sheriffs. They interviewed me on Mississippi Public Broadcasting, and Sharita Brent. Poor thing, I shouldn't repeat this, but I can't resist it. She said, well, what was your most shocking case? And I thought of one that was long and involved, and I thought of a simple one. I said, well, it was the sheriff of Sunflower County. We caught him for not paying income tax, federal income tax, on all the bribes he received. And the judge said, I hereby sentence you to 18 months in federal prison. He turned to his lawyer and said, a little bit too loud in a whisper, says, 18 months? I can hold my fist up a bear's ass longer than that. I told that one to Sharita Brent, and she cut off the tape. Boom, that was the end of that tape. But yeah, I'd say the trickiest ones are probably bankers, stockbrokers. Those are, because their whole game is deception and being subtle and getting up to the line without crossing it. Whereas public officials, they know their own. One of my favorite parts of criminal practice is the polygraph. Polygraph is not usually admissible in court, but it's a great investigative tool, and it works. People with a conscience, will just flunk it. I've had a few. Only people I've ever had that I thought beat a polygraph were white-collar criminals who were very subtle and had no conscience. They didn't make the needles jump because they didn't feel anything when they lied. They were true sociopaths.
Did you ever not prosecute someone as a result of a polygraph test?
I can't think of one offhand. I know one thing that we use the polygraph for a lot is say something happens where there's a mass of people, like there's a killing and 20 people there, is just polygraph everybody, and that way you weed them out. And we have had a couple. I don't think we ever had to lose one, but we've had what we call a high noon shootout, where it's a one-on-one. We're not too sure what it is. Say, okay, I get to pick the polygraph examiner, and if your guy takes the polygraph, if he passes, we drop the case. If he flunks, he pleads guilty. I've done 3 or 4 of those, and so far they all flunked, but I'm sure there's someone out there who could beat it, but that's only where a case is a toss-up anyway.
So as the years passed, when you were a prosecutor, you probably became more adept at choosing juries?
Yeah, that's, I've got some of my law students in my class in trial practice here. That was always my favorite part of the trial, was picking the jury, voir diring the jury, questioning them. That's the one time you actually get to talk to them, and they get to talk back. You ask them questions, and you learn what they're like, what their leanings are, what you think they'd be like. What was your question?
Did you get more adept at selecting jurors?
Oh yeah, well one thing I learned was that was not one of my best skills. There was a guy in our office named Sonny Mason who was, he just had a gift. He's this big old country guy. So, oh shucks, but he could pick out people. I'd get Sonny to come and sit at the council table with me, and we'd voir dire the jury. And I'd look at him, Sonny, who's going to be the foreman? He could pick them out, put 12 people up there. He could tell you who the leader was. He just was a master. So I got better at that, and I never did believe in these professional jury consultants. You pay them $50,000 and they psychoanalyze them. I never found that effect. I thought it was more a matter of intuition and instinct and just raw human talent. There's one story I got to tell you. I was prosecuting a bookie. Since we're at Ole Miss, I can tell this. The bookie had an associate who was the chairman of the psychology department. I'm not kidding, at Mississippi State University. And this guy did hundreds of thousands of dollars a month in booking and sports booking. And when we first looked at it, it made me a little nervous. I was afraid it looked like I might be a trainer on the Mississippi State basketball team that was involved, but fortunately it didn't turn out that way. But the defense attorney says, oh, my poor client's being prejudiced. He lives in Hattiesburg. I said, yeah, well, he shouldn't have committed a crime in this district. But he needs to be tried in front. He's going to testify, and he has all these witnesses. It would be a hardship for them to have to travel to Oxford. So the judge kindly moves the trial to Hattiesburg. And we're trying the case in Hattiesburg. Of course, when we get through, he doesn't even put on any witnesses, but he tries to tamper with mine. But I was picking a jury, and my opponent, one of my law school classmates, there's this big old lady who was she was all muscle. And you have a description on the jury list of what they do for a living. Hers just said pulpwood. Some people say lawyer, dentist, right? She's pulpwood. So my opponent gets somebody and says, now ma'am, she had real short iron gray hair and kind of serious looking, looked like she should be handing you a big mug of beer or something. She's like this, sit down. He said, ma'am, you're in the pulpwood business. Yes, sir. What do you do? He meant to say, what did you do before you did pulpwood, before you haul pulpwood? What do you do before you haul pulpwood? And she said, cut it. And that was, and of course, she was the foreman. He didn't take her off. The jury was all laughing. I had another one time where the lady stands up and she's wearing a real tight dress, real short, low cut, very attractive. And I asked her, well, I was asking about what they do, what their husband does. Well, what do you do? She says, I'm a housewife. I stay home. I says, what does your husband do? What does your husband do? And she says, he's a body man. And first, just a couple of snickers. And then before we knew it, the judge, everybody was laughing. She's just red as a beaten pot. She says, I mean, he has a body shop. He fixes car bodies. She was so embarrassed that the judge excused her from the jury. She didn't want to be around there. But I always thought jurors are fascinating.
Is there a certain kind of person you absolutely didn't want as a juror?
What a shock. My father was an engineer, electrical engineer. And the book says people like that, serious, conservative. But I learned, no, you don't ever want an engineer if you're a prosecutor. They're too nitpicky. A criminal case is never clear cut. It's always vague, has too much human in it. It's not mathematical. And I've had, well, it only happened once. I never did it again, but I had an engineer hang up a jury on me. It was 11-1. He just said the proof is not, that's his word, precise enough. We need precise proof. Well, in a criminal case, you don't have precise proof. Usually not. You have to use human judgment. If there was precise proof, they'd have pled guilty. Mm-hmm. That's one thing about trials. The easy cases plead guilty. That's no problem. It's the tricky ones that go to trial. That's what makes them challenging.
What about plea bargains? Is that a good thing to have in the judicial system?
Absolutely. Now, it's subject to abuse. You can hide a lot. Plea bargains, like I would say, are no bargain for the defendants. I mean, we don't just give them away. Mm-hmm.
Would you always try to plea bargain a case if you could?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. A few times I sort of wish they wouldn't take it because I felt like the public needed to know. And the only way they can know is if you go to trial. Now, when you have a plea agreement, we call them agreements, no bargains.
Sorry.
Or the defendants always say, oh, your witness got a sweetheart deal. This one lady said, it ain't sweet to me. I'm going to the pen. I don't know about you. But the plea agreements, it is a two-way street. Almost always you want them to testify. You may want them to wear a hidden mic and catch a drug dealer. You want them to tell what they know about other crimes, particularly about this crime. But you can't make one with them if they're too sleazy. They're no good to you as a witness. You put them on stand, nobody's going to believe them. So, it takes judgment. It's a good question. Remember one time we had a plea agreement before Judge Davidson. I'd been teaching in Moscow, Russia, and had been over there a couple of weeks and seen some really interesting Russian jury trials. And the Russian prosecutors who had hosted us, we brought them over here. And I took them up one day. I thought, well, it was some pretty interesting case where people were going to plead guilty. And they did not have plea bargains in Russia. Didn't allow it. But there you had to put the case on, which is a huge waste of time and money when the guy says, look, I did it. So they were studying what the plea bargains. So we brought this guy up here and said, now, Mrs. So-and-so, the judge said, is it a fact that you did this, and you did that, and you did that, and you did that? Yes, sir, yes, sir, yes, sir, yes, sir. And you satisfied with the lawyer? Yes, sir. Is there anything you'll disagree with? No, sir. How do you plead? Guilty. How many counts? 19. Guilty, 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 guilty. So Judge Davis is real proud of how organized and orderly our procedure was and went so fast. Said to this woman from Siberia, said, now I'm a real attractive Russian woman, big blonde hair. Says, now, can you imagine this case happening in your country? And she says, oh, yes, Your Honor, I can imagine it easily. We have them come up and they say, yes, sir, yes, sir, yes, sir. And the New York Times says, show trial in Russia. So they can look bad, and you don't want to railroad somebody. One of the most subtle ones we had was, of course, Zach Scruggs. That was tricky. He didn't want to plead. His lawyer was leaning on him to plead, and they got the case bargained down to where it was kind of ambiguous. After he served his time and got out, he went back and challenged it. said, I didn't really plead guilty. I didn't really admit to what they say. And if I did plead, what I did was no longer a crime. I should have my record cleared. That was a real close case. It's a dicey case. So when you enter into a plea agreement, that's what I said. A plea agreement is a contract with a criminal. So you got to be careful. You may give away too much. It may look really bad to the press. The public may say, oh my God, they let that guy off with nothing. Why'd they do that? Well, we may have had a real weak case and we figured that's the best we can get. But yeah, it's natural people would debate plea agreements. And it's a heavy obligation for a prosecutor and a defense attorney to get it right. They don't want to sell their guy down the river. They want it to be a fair deal, and it's always subject to debate.
You write some in your book about your involvement internationally for the Justice Department. How is it that a prosecuting attorney from Oxford, Mississippi would be involved in these international events? And you not only were involved, but you played a leadership role.
It all goes back to that lady when I was a senior in high school. She wouldn't let me go out with her daughter, said I was too countrified. And my mother heard this and said to my father, dear, we're sending Johnny to Paris. Nobody calls my son countrified. We're going to get his rough edges knocked off. So they sent me off after a couple of prep skill adventures. And I went to the Sorbonne in Paris for 2 years, came back as an interpreter. And because I could speak French fluently, they first sent me to school in Paris, the legal school, prosecutor school. And we negotiated some criminal cooperation treaties with them. And then Tom Dawson kindly let me take his place and took a deposition in Geneva, Switzerland, largely in French. And then from that they said, hey, we need somebody, you've spent time in the Arab world. Would you like to go to Tunisia and meet some guys with the PLO? Speak French. So I got to Tunisia and then Morocco, they spoke French. Then they sent me to the Republic of Moldova just after it left the Soviet Union. I said, Moldova? Where is that? And they said, oh, it's easy. It's right between Romania and Ukraine. I said, oh, yeah, well, that clears it up nicely. So they said, why are you sending me? I said, they speak French in Moldova. I said, no kidding, that's funny. So I started reading about they stopped speaking French in Moldova in the 1920s when the Russians took it over. So anyway, but got there and they said, hey, this guy, somehow he gets along with these communists. So then they sent me to Russia, the Republic of Georgia, and then because of the Arab countries, Oman, the Sultanate of Oman, which is just a pleasurable, wonderful name. The best of all was Bali, Indonesia. They had a terrorist attack there, and we were talking to the Indonesians both about public corruption and about terrorists, what we'd done. Yeah.
So how did you keep your colleagues, some of whom are here tonight, from being extremely jealous of you?
Well, it was interesting. They were just good guys, I think, is a secret. But I know we had a couple of U.S. attorneys. When I came back, they'd have me talk about where I went. And people, I thought that was good, we shared. And then we had a couple who didn't want me to talk about it. It was kind of like the FBI. I would, I wrote a wine column on the side. Thanks, Charles hired me to write the wine column for Gannett News Service. And I never mentioned, I thought that was unpopular. And some things you just don't mention. Some people I said, well, I just got back from Paris, or son of a bitch. So, but something better not mention. But most people were curious enough that they said, man, what's it like in the Republic of Georgia, up in the Caucasus, where they write poems to their daggers? They all wear daggers and these big wool hats and things. I don't know, I think maybe I liked it so much they didn't mind. I still owe Dawson a couple of trips.
We'd like to go to the audience now for any questions or observations with John. And while you're thinking about raising your hand, John and I used to go to dinner in Washington when I was with Gannett. And it was the only person I knew before or since where we would go through about 4 bottles of wine. And it's not like we were drinking a lot, but there were 4 different bottles because John was a wine expert. And when I left, Gannett earnings went up because they didn't have to pay for John's dinners and wine. Who'd like to ask John a question? such a fascinating career, and he's recounted it in such good terms here. Anybody? Yes.
John, after reading your book, I couldn't remember if you wrote about any Alcorn County crime, and it's not that Alcorn County was a clean county by any means. What did you run up against in Alcorn County?
I want to repeat for our television audience. The question is, did you prosecute any crime in Alcorn County? And if I can paraphrase, and if not, why not?
Alcorn County just Alcorn County just so honest with you. No crime there. I do remember one case, classic Alcorn County case. We had a complaint from the voting rights section in Washington. There'd been bribery and vote buying. So we had the FBI investigate, and they came back and they caught the deputy sheriff who was buying the votes, but we had a little bit of a dilemma. He was buying them for both sides. It was, and we finally just got him to resign and didn't prosecute that one. But I've got a second book coming out next year called Return to Guntown, which has a couple of Alcorn County cases in it. I remember Judge Biggers was a DA when they, Buford Pusser and all of them were up there. Some pretty colorful characters in that area. I never did personally have any of those cases.
John is the most prolific writer. From my time going back when I was with the Gannett Foundation, and we had fellows come into Columbia University for a year to write books, going forward to here, some of those writers would want an extension, and they wouldn't even have half finished their books. They'd mess around, they'd do other things. John wrote 3 books while he was a fellow here at the Overby Center, and 2 of them are just waiting to be published. So he's very prolific. Yes, sir.
I just wanted to make a statement that he may not have done so much in Alcorn County, but he cleaned up the soda. Plus the sheriff.
So how is it that, for our TV audience, John put away 4 out of 5 supervisors plus the sheriff from DeSoto County? So what was it about DeSoto County that made it so inviting for a prosecutor?
Well, we went in with some serious illusions. We figured it was a spillover from Memphis. Memphis is a high crime city. We got in there and found just the opposite. All the people who lived in the suburbs and commuted to work in Memphis, they were straight. We'd always taken them on jury. The corruption was deep-seated and local. It was kind of like, I hate to say, but like Prentiss County or Marshall County. Corruption is just endemic. It's just part of it's in the water. I always say one thing that surprises me when I have a talk is no one ever asks about civil rights cases. But some of the civil rights cases are very important. Others, surprisingly, are funny. I had one time, I had a cross-burning case. I'd say this because it's from DeSoto County. This lady called and she said, I need to bring my boy and he needs to talk to you. So she brings me in. She says, now, sit down here and tell him the truth. She leaves. He's hanging his head. We'd had a cross-burning in a yard of this black family in Lake Cormorant, Mississippi, kind of a conservative rural area. And he said, well, I was just tell me how it happened. He said, well, a friend and I and my girlfriend were drinking beer. We drank a couple of quarts, and we decided we wanted to make these black people move away. We didn't want them in our neighborhood. So we went out in the shed, and all we had for wood was 2 2x4s. So I got a handful of nails and a hammer and a gas can. We went down and tried to build a cross, and he said, by the time we got there, I dropped all the nails but one. And when I tried to make the crossbar kept slipping. So he said, fine. I said, oh, the hell with that. I just put it like this and nailed it on the top. And when a lady came to me and told me about the cross, she said, it looks like a T to me. I think they meant it to be a cross. And they spray painted KKK on it. He said, well, what happened was, he said, I used to think I was a pretty good shade tree mechanic till that car fell on my head. So that's probably why I did it. He said, my friend had a gas can and said, I told him to pour the gas on the thing, and he said, no, I've got the lighter, you pour it. So he said, I started pouring the gas on the cross, and he lit it too soon. Instead of lighting the cross, it lit me up. he went running across the yard because his arm was all burned. But I had a lady from the Civil Rights Division I thought was real aggressive. She was going to put him away forever. But I walked him out, got him back together with his mother, and I kind of felt sorry for him. So I went back in there, expecting her to say, "Good, I like the way you broke him down, made him confess. That was great." Instead, she was crying. She said, "That's the saddest thing I've ever heard." He's pathetic. So anyway, there's a plea agreement. He pled guilty, got probation, some supervision, which he really needed. So there's an example of a plea agreement in DeSoto County.
All in one.
All in one.
Anybody else? Yes, sir.
What's your reaction to the Supreme Court repeal part of Voter Rights Act, Section 4?
Question is, what is John's reaction to the Supreme Court repealing a major section of the Voting Rights Act?
That was, if I had a secret, that was one of them. I never got involved in anything near politics. I was always the office's election officer. And when the Republicans were in, they'd call and just pour out their heart to me. They figured I was a Republican. When the Democrats were in office, they'd call, same thing. They thought I was a Democrat. So I try to stay away from those politically tinged things. You can argue both sides. It's tricky. We can't be discriminated against forever. But it could hurt in some cases. I think that the Justice Department is now in a position to say where there really is a chance of discrimination, they can bring suits. It's a lot harder. And I know, for example, a good example is Oxford. One reason Oxford is so crowded, and we have, maybe now 20,000 people in Oxford and 30,000 people right around it that are not zoned into Oxford, they don't want to go through the hassle of getting approved by the Civil Rights Division, to change. And we have a big problem in this country right now with gerrymandering. One reason that Congress is so split, they've gerrymandered things to where, okay, this is a safe Democratic seat, this is a safe Republican seat. I'd have to say I'm a raging moderate. I like compromise, and we've kind of legislated around compromising. In that sense, maybe it'll be a positive. Although I'm in favor of clean elections, obviously, but the idea of having a voter ID, having to have an ID at the polls, I don't think it's going to cure any problems, and it's making some people feel discriminated against. So I don't think that's an example of how these laws can be misused. When it looks like it's fair, you may be able to misuse it. So didn't mean to punt on the question, but it's not easy.
Two things on the Voting Rights Act. Bill Rose, who is a fellow here at the Overby Center, is directing a major project on an in-depth look at the Voting Rights Act. And in the spring, we're going to have a major program here about that. So if you'll come back for that. Maybe we'll get John to come back. Any last questions? John, we want to thank you for coming tonight. Most of the people here are your friends. We have been charmed and enchanted and educated by knowing you and being with you over the years. And this book is a synthesis of some of your wisdom. We look forward to the next two books that are coming out and hope you'll come back to the center and talk with us. Thank you for being here.
You see why I like him so well. Thank you.